The one day that really stands out in particular is the day of identification. Everything about that day is so clear in my mind. Everything from what the audiologist said, the expression on her face. I can see the little ear molds and little tubs sitting there in the theatre room. Yeah, it's just as clear as day. And in that time, it really, one of the overwhelming sensations was this significant sense of loss. In fact, it actually, for me, felt like the children that I thought I knew had died, like they had disappeared. And one of the reasons is because here we don't have newborn screening, so they're already 3. And from chatting to a few other parents, I realized that this is not necessarily a unique experience. So how can parents think about or frame some of the really difficult experiences and feelings during such a dark time, such as the day that they found out that their child was deaf or that their child had a disability?
Sure. I just wanted to start by saying I would never assume to know what somebody is feeling or how somebody is feeling. Even people experiencing the same event at the same time, it's a completely unique and individual experience for every single individual. So just to put that in context for me is important, as I'd never want anyone to think that I know or for me to be assuming how somebody is feeling. It's really important to recognize the experience for what it is. First of all, that extreme shock that comes with receiving news or having an experience that you're just not prepared for. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, it's their worst nightmare, it's their greatest fear, it's completely unexpected. That's shock and that's trauma, and we need to recognize that. With shock and trauma, we go into an acute stress response, which is characterized by physical symptoms, by emotional experiences, and by psychological, the different thoughts we have, feelings, physical experiences we have. It's important to recognize the existence of stress, trauma, shock. Secondary to that, you mentioned the word loss. With loss, we experience grief. It's important to have quite a good understanding of grief for us to recognize that what we experience or what we are experiencing is grief, and to know that grief is a process that we work through. In an ideal world, we have different stages of grief. You can easily read about those 5 different stages of grief, from the idea of bargaining, denial, moving through to sadness, anger, and then acceptance. It's important to know that's not a linear approach, that we experience a different set of emotions all of the time. We can be in that state of denial. It isn't happening. I refuse it to be true. I want further testing done. That bargaining stage of, well, perhaps if we can do this, then it won't be so. And those stages of anger and sadness are really intense. They come and go, they interchange with one another. That process of working towards acceptance is a real journey. And acceptance is not a final destination that we reach and go, I'm there, I've got acceptance. Sometimes we move forward, sometimes backwards, but working with grief and loss is often a lifelong journey that we have to process in our own time and in our own way, together with the shock and the trauma. The first step in that process is recognizing the experience for what it is, shock, trauma, and grief, and then starting working through those different emotions so that we can slowly get our head around and start processing our life as we know it and the current reality that we're now faced with, and then what that means for the future. We can also experience loss in terms of the loss of a future that we thought we would have. There's a lot of grief around that also. There's a lot to process.
And for mother and father in the home, is it possible for them to experience the grief quite differently? Because I think they can also be quite lonely for one parent to feel like they almost don't see the other parent experiencing the same thing.
Very much so. Everybody experiences grief differently. It's such an individual and such a unique process. I think one of the most frustrating things that you can say to a person when they're grieving is that expression, "I know how you feel." The immediate response to that is, "No, you don't. Even though you were also the parent, you don't know how I feel." It's quite infuriating for an individual experiencing such an emotion to be told that. So all members of a family, everyone experiences grief differently. We can never assume to know what another person is experiencing or how they're feeling. And in that way, it is a very lonely journey, extremely lonely. Nobody really knows how you're feeling. Often the individual themselves can't place exactly how they're feeling. There aren't words that they can find to describe that grief, that loss, the shock and the trauma, and that's different for everybody. It's important to be able to recognize that emotion in itself. I feel lonely. I feel alone in this. And to be able to communicate that also, extremely lonely.
We mentioned acceptance, and I think one of the statistics that research shows is that outcomes of a deaf child are largely dependent on the parent's active involvement. And I've often thought that to reach that point where you can be actively involved, and a lot of that involves having fun with your child and other things like that, requires you to reach a place of somewhat of acceptance. And that, I think, just from my own journey, what helped with part of the acceptance for me was meeting other deaf people who were the epitome of all those losses, as you said, the future losses that I initially felt. So to see a deaf adult who was independent and had their own family really, really helped with acceptance and just having that mentorship from them, as well as other families going through it. And while everybody is experiencing it differently, that is severe loneliness is softened a little bit by feeling like there's somebody else who's been there, either just ahead of you or at least knows what some of the complexities are. So I'm sure there'll be other people other than parents watching this. It might be professionals or family members. Is there some advice that you can give them in terms of supporting families during this first stages, which includes their grief journey?
There are three very important things that come to mind straight away. One of those is the value of community. It's really important to belong, or at least feel as though you belong to a community, to have access to some kind of community. The second part comes in the form of support. So community provides that level of support, as well as family members and friends. So support and community are two huge factors that are so important when we work through this process. The third one is having space to tell and retell your story, just to be able to talk. It really is huge in terms of processing and any emotional experience that we're grappling with in a lifetime, but particularly loss and grief and shock and trauma, is having space to talk, whether it's talking about how you're feeling, whether it's telling the story of how things unfolded, whether it's talking about your day-to-day challenges, what's easy, what's difficult. Just having space to talk is so important. And that comes through connecting with people in community and through experiencing support. So together, support, community, and just being able to talk encourage us along this really, really difficult journey, and allowing us to reach a place where we possibly don't achieve acceptance, as I said, as an end goal or as a destination, but where we work towards feeling a sense of comfort, maybe a sense of understanding from other people, just feeling a little bit more like we're coping. That comes through working towards that stage of acceptance, which comes from support and community and just being able to talk.
And I think that's so helpful, because my experience often with professionals and being a professional myself has just made me reflect on that, is that families are often not given the time to grieve or to feel, because it's this urgent emergency of getting into the child's various therapies, etc. And yeah, so if other people just give families a space to tell their story, to talk, to feel, I think that's really helpful.